I was sitting in advanced chemistry when my world turned upside down. The EpiPen in my backpack felt heavier than usual that morning, like it knew what was coming. We were doing lab work with various compounds when I started feeling that familiar tightness in my throat. My hands began tingling, the warning signs I'd learned to recognize since I was 7 years old. Severe food allergies don't give you much time to think. "Mrs. Patterson," I called out, my voice already getting hoarse. "I need to go to the nurse immediately. I'm having an allergic reaction." She barely looked up from grading papers at her desk. "Absolutely not, Marcus. We're in the middle of standardized testing week. The district supervisors are conducting random classroom observations today." My throat was closing fast now. "You don't understand. I'm allergic to shellfish, and something in these chemicals is triggering a reaction. I need my EpiPen." "Sit down and stop being dramatic. You're disrupting the learning environment." The room started spinning. I could feel my airways constricting like someone was slowly tightening a rope around my neck. My lips were already swelling, making it harder to speak clearly. "Please," I wheezed, stumbling toward my backpack. "I'm going into anaphylactic shock." That's when she stood up and blocked my path to where my emergency medication was stored. "No student leaves this classroom during observation hours. Those are the rules from administration. You can wait 30 more minutes until the supervisor finishes their evaluation." My vision blurred as I tried to push past her. The other students were starting to notice something was seriously wrong. Emma, who sat 2 seats behind me, had her phone out trying to get signal. "His face is turning red," someone whispered. "Look at his neck. Those are hives." Another student said. Mrs. Patterson spun around to face the class. "Everyone back to your work. This is exactly the kind of disruption that could cost us our excellent rating." I collapsed against the lab table, knocking over a beaker of some solution that splashed across the floor. The chemical smell made my reaction worse. My tongue was swelling now, filling my mouth so I could barely breathe. "I'm calling 911, Emma announced, holding up her phone. "You absolutely will not," Mrs. Patterson snarled, marching over and snatching the phone from Emma's hands. "No unauthorized phone use during observation periods. That's an automatic detention." My chest felt like it was being crushed by invisible hands. Each breath was a struggle that required every ounce of energy I had left. I tried to crawl toward my backpack where my EpiPen waited, but Mrs. Patterson stepped directly in front of it. "Stop this performance right now, Marcus. I know what you're doing. Last month you tried to leave during the state math assessment, claiming you felt dizzy." The class was dead silent now, except for my labored breathing. Everyone could see I was dying, but nobody moved. They were all too terrified of Mrs. Patterson's reputation for giving zeros to entire classes when she got angry. "His lips are turning blue," whispered Jake from the front row. "Someone help him," Emma pleaded, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Patterson's face went hard as stone. "Anyone who leaves their seat or uses their phone will receive an F for the semester. The district supervisor is watching everything through the security cameras." That was a lie. I found out later there were no cameras in the chemistry lab due to safety regulations about recording chemical experiments. My fingers clawed at my throat, trying to create more space for air that wouldn't come. The world was getting darker around the edges. I had maybe 2 minutes before my brain would shut down from lack of oxygen. Then something snapped inside me. If I was going to die, I wasn't going down without a fight. I lunged toward my backpack with whatever strength I had left. Mrs. Patterson tried to grab my arms, but I twisted away and fell hard against the lab bench. The impact knocked over 3 more beakers, sending glass and chemicals everywhere. "Security!" she screamed into the classroom intercom. "I need security in room 247 immediately. A student is destroying school property and being violent." With my last conscious thought, I grabbed my EpiPen from the backpack and drove it into my thigh through my jeans. The needle went deep and the medicine started flowing into my system. Mrs. Patterson actually tried to pull the EpiPen out of my leg. "What did you just inject yourself with?" she demanded. "That could be drugs for all I know." I couldn't answer. The world was going black. The next thing I remember was waking up in an ambulance with paramedics working over me. One of them was saying something about how I was minutes away from cardiac arrest. "Blood pressure is stabilizing," a paramedic called out. "But his oxygen levels are still critical. How long was he without proper breathing?" The school nurse said at least 8 minutes from when she got the call to when we arrived. The other one answered, "Kid's lucky to be alive." At the hospital, they had to give me 3 more doses of epinephrine and put me on a breathing machine for 2 hours. The doctor explained that my reaction was so severe, it caused something called biphasic anaphylaxis, where your body has a second reaction hours later that can be even worse than the first. My mom arrived looking like she'd aged 10 years in one morning. She held my hand while the doctor explained how close I'd come to dying. "Another 3 minutes and we would have been looking at permanent brain damage," he said quietly. "What took so long for him to get medical attention?" When Mom explained what Mrs. Patterson had done, the doctor's face went white. He immediately called hospital administration and they contacted Child Protective Services. A teacher physically prevented a student from using life-saving medication? The CPS worker asked, taking notes, and blocked other students from calling for help. The hospital social worker started documenting everything: my swollen throat, the injection site where I'd administered the EpiPen, the chemical burns on my hands from when I'd fallen against the lab bench. Meanwhile, my phone was exploding with messages from classmates. Emma had recorded everything on her phone, even after Mrs. Patterson took it away. She'd started a second recording on her smartwatch. The video was grainy, but you could clearly hear Mrs. Patterson telling me to stop being dramatic while I was obviously struggling to breathe. You could see her physically blocking my access to my backpack and threatening the class with failing grades if anyone helped. Jake had filmed the moment I collapsed and started turning blue. The timestamp showed exactly how long Mrs. Patterson let me suffer before I managed to inject the EpiPen myself. This is attempted murder. My mom said after watching the videos, she literally tried to kill you. The principal called that evening while I was still in the hospital. He used a lot of fancy words about unfortunate incidents and reviewing protocols, but never once apologized. He kept mentioning the teachers' union and how these situations were complex. Complex? My mom interrupted. A teacher prevented a dying child from getting medication. How is that complex? The principal cleared his throat. Well, Mrs. Patterson maintains she was following district guidelines about maintaining classroom order during evaluation periods. Show me those guidelines, Mom demanded. I want to see exactly where it says teachers should let students die to maintain order. Long pause. I'll have someone from the district office contact you. Nobody from the district ever called. When I went back to school 3 days later, kids stared at me in the hallways like I was some kind of ghost. Word had spread fast about what happened in chemistry class. Mrs. Patterson was still teaching. She acted like nothing had happened when I walked into her classroom. Good morning, Marcus. I trust you're feeling better. Please take your seat so we can continue with yesterday's lesson. I sat down and immediately felt my chest tighten up again. Not from allergies, from pure rage and trauma. My hands started shaking as I stared at the spot where I'd almost died while she watched. Emma leaned over and whispered, "Are you okay? You look pale." "I can't be in here," I whispered back. "I can't breathe." I raised my hand. "Mrs. Patterson, I need to step out for a moment." "Absolutely not. You've already missed enough class time this week." The room felt like it was spinning. I could smell those same chemical fumes from the lab, and my throat started closing up again. Not from allergies this time, but from panic. I stood up without asking and walked toward the door. "Sit down immediately or you'll receive detention," she called after me. I kept walking. Emma quietly gathered my books and followed me out. In the hallway, I slumped against the lockers trying to catch my breath. The school nurse found me there 10 minutes later and took me to her office. "Panic attacks are completely normal after what you went through," she said gently. "Your brain is trying to protect you from what it sees as a dangerous situation." "She's still teaching," I managed to say. "She almost killed me and she's still teaching." The nurse's jaw tightened. "I've filed 3 separate reports about what happened. The administration is reviewing the situation." That afternoon, my mom and I met with the principal again. This time, she brought a lawyer. "We're prepared to file both criminal charges and a civil lawsuit," the lawyer announced. "Attempted manslaughter, child endangerment, violation of federal disability protections, and intentional infliction of emotional distress." The principal's face went gray. "Now let's not be hasty. These situations are always complicated. Mrs. Patterson is a veteran teacher with an excellent record. She has 3 previous complaints for refusing to accommodate students with medical needs," our lawyer said, sliding a folder across the desk. "This isn't her first time putting a child's life at risk. Turns out Mrs. Patterson had blocked a diabetic student from testing their blood sugar 2 years ago. Another time, she'd refused to let an asthmatic student use their inhaler during a fire drill because it would disrupt the evacuation procedure. The school had quietly settled both cases and moved those families to other districts. We're not settling, my mom said firmly. We're going public with this. The principal tried to negotiate. What if we moved Marcus to a different chemistry class and provided some additional medical training for staff? What if Mrs. Patterson faces actual consequences for nearly killing a child? My mom shot back. The meeting ended with the principal promising to review all the options and get back to us. That weekend, Emma posted the video footage on TikTok with the caption, "Teacher blocks student from life-saving medication." The video went viral overnight, 2.3 million views and climbing. The comment section exploded. Parents were sharing their own horror stories about teachers who ignored medical emergencies. News outlets started reaching out for interviews. By Monday morning, protesters were gathered outside the school with signs demanding Mrs. Patterson's termination. The local news had vans parked across the street. Mrs. Patterson was suddenly out sick that day, and the next day, and the rest of the week. The substitute teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, was amazing. On the first day, he spent 10 minutes going over the classroom's emergency procedures and showing everyone where the medical supplies were kept. If any student has a medical emergency, they have my permission to do whatever they need to save their life, he announced. I don't care if the president himself is observing this class. Your health comes first, always. The district finally called an emergency school board meeting. The auditorium was packed with angry parents and students. Several local news cameras were set up in the back. When it was my turn to speak, I walked up to the microphone with my hands shaking, but my voice was steady. Mrs. Patterson watched me dying and chose her evaluation score over my life. She physically prevented me from accessing medication that could have saved me. She threatened to fail my classmates if they called for help. I held up my EpiPen. This costs $300 and it saved my life, but only because I was strong enough to fight past a teacher who wanted to let me die rather than deal with paperwork. The audience was completely silent. How many other students have to almost die before you fire teachers who see our medical emergencies as inconveniences? The applause was deafening. 3 board members resigned that night rather than vote on Mrs. Patterson's termination. The remaining board voted unanimously to fire her immediately. But the teachers' union filed an appeal, claiming she was terminated without due process. The case dragged on for 8 months while she collected full pay sitting in the district office. During those months, I learned things about Mrs. Patterson that made everything make more sense. She'd been passed over for department head 3 times. Her husband had left her the previous year. Her own son had stopped talking to her after she missed his graduation to attend a teaching conference. None of that excused what she did to me, but it explained why she was so desperate to impress the district supervisors that she'd sacrifice a student's life. The union appeal was eventually denied. Mrs. Patterson lost her teaching license permanently and had to pay $50,000 in damages to our family. She moved to another state where nobody knew her story. The school implemented new policies requiring annual medical emergency training for all staff. They installed emergency phones in every classroom that connected directly to 911. Students with medical conditions got special passes, allowing them to leave any situation where they felt unsafe. Most importantly, they hired a full-time nurse practitioner who understood that no administrative policy was worth more than a student's life. I graduated with honors and got into my first choice college with a pre-med major. Every time I use my EpiPen now, which thankfully isn't often, I think about how close I came to never having a future at all. Emma and I are still friends. She sends me updates about the school and the positive changes that happened after my case went public. 3 more teachers have been fired for ignoring student medical needs. The chemistry lab has a new safety protocol now. Any student who reports feeling unwell for any reason gets immediate access to the nurse, no questions asked. They have emergency medication stored in a locked cabinet that any staff member can access in seconds. Jake, who filmed my collapse, became a paramedic. He says watching me almost die made him want to save lives instead of just standing by during emergencies. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been strong enough to inject that EpiPen myself. If Emma hadn't been brave enough to record everything. If my mom hadn't been willing to fight the system. How many kids have died because teachers like Mrs. Patterson decided their evaluations mattered more than student lives? I'll never know. But I hope my case made it harder for teachers to get away with that kind of negligence. The panic attacks stopped eventually. The nightmares faded. The anger transformed into something more useful. Determination to make sure no other kid goes through what I did. These days, when I tell people I almost died in chemistry class, they assume it was from an explosion or chemical fire. When I explain that it was actually from a teacher who chose bureaucracy over basic human decency, their faces always show the same shock. A teacher did that? To a kid having an allergic reaction? Yes. And she almost got away with it. That's the moment I lost all respect for not just one teacher, but for a system that protects adults who endanger children. But it's also the moment I learned that students have more power than we think. We just have to be brave enough to use it. The day I fought for my own life in that chemistry lab wasn't just about surviving anaphylactic shock. It was about refusing to let authority figures treat my existence as disposable. Every breath I take now is a victory over everyone who thought my life didn't matter. And that's a lesson worth sharing. The weeks following my near-death experience brought revelations that made everything even more disturbing. Emma's older sister worked at the district office and quietly slipped us copies of Mrs. Patterson's personnel file. What we found made my stomach turn. There were 17 separate complaints about Mrs. Patterson over her 15-year career. 17 times parents had reported her for ignoring student medical needs, being cruel to kids with disabilities, or creating unsafe classroom environments. The district had buried every single complaint in bureaucratic paperwork. One report from 2019 described how she'd forced a student with Crohn's disease to sit in soiled clothes for 2 hours because bathroom breaks weren't allowed during standardized testing. Another, from 2021, detailed how she'd confiscated an asthmatic student's inhaler, claiming it was probably just anxiety, and the student needed to toughen up. The most chilling report was from 2020. A student with epilepsy had a seizure during her class. Instead of calling for help, Mrs. Patterson told the class to ignore the attention-seeking behavior and continue working. Other students finally called 911 themselves when the seizure lasted over 5 minutes. How did she keep her job? I asked our lawyer after reading through the files. The teachers' union has very strong protections, he explained. It takes overwhelming evidence of misconduct to terminate a tenured teacher, and most families don't want to go through a long legal battle. But we weren't most families. My mom had grown up in foster care after her parents died in a car accident. She'd learned early that if you don't fight for yourself, nobody else will. She'd put herself through nursing school, working 3 jobs, and had 0 patience for adults who endangered children. We're going to destroy her career, Mom said calmly while organizing our evidence files. And we're going to make sure the district can never sweep this under the rug again. The first step was getting the media involved. Emma's TikTok video had already gone viral, but we needed serious journalism to dig deeper into the systemic problems. Sarah Chen, an investigative reporter from the state capitol, drove 3 hours to interview me. She'd covered education issues for 12 years and immediately understood the bigger picture. This isn't just about one bad teacher, she explained while setting up her recording equipment. This is about a system that values administrative convenience over student safety. The interview took 4 hours. Sarah asked detailed questions about every aspect of what happened: the timeline, the witnesses, the aftermath, the district's response. She also interviewed Emma, Jake, and 3 other students who'd been in the classroom. But the most powerful part of her investigation came when she started calling the families from those 17 previous complaints. 12 of them agreed to go on the record. Mrs. Patterson had a pattern. She targeted students with medical conditions, disabilities, or mental health issues. She saw them as troublemakers, disrupting her perfectly ordered classroom. She'd ignore their needs, humiliate them publicly, and retaliate against anyone who tried to help. The story ran as a 5-part series in the state's largest newspaper: How One District Failed Its Most Vulnerable Students. Part 1 detailed my case with a full timeline and witness statements. Part 2 exposed the 17 prior complaints and how the district had ignored them. Part 3 revealed that Mrs. Patterson wasn't the only teacher with a pattern of endangering students. Part 4 examined the union's role in protecting dangerous teachers. Part 5 proposed specific reforms to prevent future tragedies. The response was immediate and explosive. The state education department launched a formal investigation into the entire district. The teachers' union faced calls for leadership changes. 3 school board members were recalled by angry voters. Mrs. Patterson tried to fight back with her own narrative. She gave an interview to a right-wing podcast claiming she was the victim of cancel culture and woke parents trying to destroy traditional education. I was just maintaining classroom discipline, she insisted. These kids today think they can get out of anything by claiming medical problems. The podcast host ate it up, ranting about entitled students and liberal parents. But their audience was tiny compared to the mainstream media coverage of Sarah's investigation. More importantly, Mrs. Patterson had just admitted on tape that she didn't believe student medical emergencies were legitimate. Our lawyer was delighted. She just confessed to deliberate indifference in a recorded interview. This case just got a lot easier. The criminal investigation had been moving slowly until that podcast aired. Suddenly, the district attorney's office was very interested in prosecuting Mrs. Patterson for reckless endangerment. We have clear evidence that she knowingly prevented a minor from accessing life-saving medication, the prosecutor explained to my family. Her own statements show she didn't care if students were actually having medical emergencies. The grand jury indicted Mrs. Patterson on 3 felony charges: reckless endangerment, child endangerment, and interfering with emergency medical services. She hired an expensive defense attorney who immediately started attacking my character. They claimed I was a troubled student who'd exaggerated a minor allergic reaction for attention. They said my family was trying to get rich from a frivolous lawsuit. Their strategy backfired spectacularly when Sarah Chen published her follow-up investigation, the defense strategy that re-victimizes students. The article detailed how defense attorneys routinely portrayed children as liars and attention seekers when adults were accused of endangering them. It included quotes from child psychologists explaining how this kind of victim blaming caused additional trauma. Public opinion turned even more against Mrs. Patterson. The courthouse was surrounded by protesters every day of her trial, holding signs that said "Believe student victims" and "Teachers don't get to choose who lives." The trial itself was devastating for Mrs. Patterson's defense. Emma's video footage was played for the jury multiple times. You could hear my labored breathing getting worse while Mrs. Patterson ignored my pleas for help. You could see her physically blocking my access to my backpack. The most damning evidence was the timeline Emma had captured on her smartwatch. The footage showed Mrs. Patterson checking the clock multiple times while I was turning blue. She knew exactly how long she was letting me suffer. Jake testified about filming my collapse and watching my lips turn purple. "I've never seen anything so scary," he told the jury. Marcus looked like he was dying and Mrs. Patterson just stood there. The paramedic who'd responded to the 911 call testified about my condition when they arrived. His oxygen saturation was at 71%. Normal is 95 to 100%. He was maybe 2 minutes from cardiac arrest. The emergency room doctor explained anaphylactic shock to the jury in simple terms. When someone's airways close from an allergic reaction, every second counts. Delaying treatment by even 5 minutes can mean the difference between life and death. Mrs. Patterson's defense attorney tried to argue that she'd been following district protocols about maintaining order during evaluation periods. But the prosecution had already proven that no such protocols existed. Mrs. Patterson had made them up. The district's own emergency response coordinator testified that teachers were specifically trained to prioritize medical emergencies over everything else, including administrative observations. "We tell teachers repeatedly that a student's life is worth more than any evaluation or test score," she stated firmly. "There are no exceptions to that rule." Mrs. Patterson took the stand in her own defense, which turned out to be a catastrophic mistake. She came across as cold and unfeeling, repeatedly referring to my life-threatening allergic reaction as disruptive behavior. "Students today will claim anything to avoid responsibility," she said during cross-examination. "I've seen kids fake seizures, panic attacks, even broken bones to get out of assignments." The prosecutor pressed her on whether she thought I was faking anaphylactic shock while turning blue and struggling to breathe. "I thought he was being dramatic," she admitted. "These kids are very good actors when they want to be." Even when his classmates were begging you to call 911? Children are easily influenced by each other's theatrics. Even when he collapsed unconscious on the floor? I've seen students faint from anxiety before. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, guilty on all 3 felony charges. Mrs. Patterson was sentenced to 4 years in prison, though she'd likely serve only 18 months with good behavior. She was also banned from working with children in any capacity for the rest of her life. The civil lawsuit settlement was much more substantial. The district agreed to pay $2.8 million to avoid a trial that would have exposed even more systemic failures. Mrs. Patterson was personally liable for an additional $300,000. But the money was never really the point. What mattered were the changes that came after. The state legislature passed Marcus's law, requiring all school employees to receive annual training on recognizing and responding to medical emergencies. Schools now had to maintain emergency medication supplies and couldn't prevent students from accessing their prescribed treatments for any reason. The law also created a statewide database tracking teachers and staff who'd been disciplined for endangering students. Districts could no longer quietly transfer problem employees to other schools without disclosure. Most importantly, students with medical conditions got ironclad legal protections. Any school employee who interfered with emergency medical treatment would face automatic termination and criminal charges. My high school became a model for emergency preparedness. They installed medical alert systems in every classroom. Students with life-threatening conditions got special ID cards that triggered immediate 911 response if scanned. The chemistry lab was redesigned with better ventilation and emergency exits. The substitute teacher who'd replaced Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Rodriguez, was hired permanently. He turned out to be an incredible educator who actually cared about his students as human beings, not just test scores. "You taught this school that students' lives matter more than adult convenience," he told me during graduation. "That's a lesson every teacher here needed to learn." Emma went on to study journalism in college, inspired by Sarah Chen's investigation. She wanted to use media to expose injustice and protect vulnerable people. Jake became a paramedic and eventually moved back to work in our hometown's emergency services. He said watching me almost die had shown him that ordinary people could be heroes just by refusing to look away when someone needed help. Even some of the students who'd stayed frozen during my medical emergency found ways to make amends. Ashley, who'd initially sided with Mrs. Patterson, became a children's rights advocate. She said the guilt of not helping me had motivated her to ensure she'd never fail another person in crisis. The ripple effects continued for years. Other districts started reviewing their own problem teachers after Sarah's investigation. Several states passed their own versions of Marcus's law. A national nonprofit formed to help families navigate legal battles against schools that endangered their children. Mrs. Patterson's case became a textbook example in education law courses. Law students studied it to understand how institutional indifference could escalate into criminal liability. Education majors analyzed it to learn about the ethical obligations teachers owe their students. I kept in touch with some of the families from those 17 previous complaints. Many of them said they wished they'd fought harder when Mrs. Patterson first hurt their children. But they also said seeing my case go public had given them closure and validation. For years, I wondered if I was overreacting, one mother told me. The school made me feel like I was a paranoid parent imagining problems. Seeing her convicted proved my child's suffering was real. That might be the most important outcome of everything that happened. Other families learned they didn't have to accept dangerous treatment of their children. They had rights. They had power. They just needed the courage to use them. My college years were relatively peaceful compared to the chaos of high school. I majored in pre-med with a focus on emergency medicine, partly inspired by the paramedics who'd saved my life. I also took education law courses to better understand the systems that had failed me. During my senior year, I was invited to speak at a national education conference about student safety and medical accommodations. The audience was mostly teachers and administrators, many of whom seemed uncomfortable hearing from a student who'd sued their profession. I don't hate teachers, I told them during my presentation. My life was saved by a substitute teacher who cared more about his students than his evaluation scores. Good teachers change lives, but when teachers abuse their power over vulnerable children, they need to face consequences. The response was mixed. Some educators came up afterward to thank me for speaking out. Others muttered about entitled students and lawsuit-happy parents. One middle-aged teacher approached me near the end of the conference. "You destroyed that woman's career," she said accusingly. "Do you feel good about that?" I looked at her calmly. She destroyed her own career when she chose to let a child suffocate rather than interrupt her class. I just survived long enough to tell people about it. The teacher walked away without another word. That exchange reminded me why my story still mattered. There were still educators who saw student suffering as acceptable collateral damage in their pursuit of professional success. They needed to understand that those days were over. Medical school was demanding, but rewarding. My personal experience with life-threatening emergencies gave me unique insight into patient care. I understood viscerally how terrifying it felt to need help while authority figures ignored your crisis. During my emergency medicine rotation, I treated several cases that reminded me of my own experience. A teenager with severe asthma who'd been denied his inhaler by a coach who thought he was being weak. A diabetic college student who'd been told by a professor that bathroom breaks disrupted the learning environment. Each time, I made sure to document everything carefully and report any adults who'd interfered with medical treatment. I'd learned that speaking up for vulnerable people was sometimes the difference between life and death. My residency director noticed my particular attention to cases involving medical neglect by authority figures. "You have a gift for recognizing when patients have been failed by the systems meant to protect them," she observed. "Have you considered specializing in emergency pediatrics?" I hadn't, but the suggestion made perfect sense. Who better to treat endangered children than someone who'd once been an endangered child himself? By the time I finished my residency, Mrs. Patterson had been released from prison and was working at a grocery store in a different state. Sarah Chen's follow-up articles tracked her post-conviction life occasionally. She lived alone, had no contact with her estranged son, and showed no signs of remorse for what she'd done. "Some people never learn," Sarah told me during one of our periodic check-ins. "But the laws that came from your case have already prevented dozens of similar tragedies. That's the real victory." She was right. Marcus's law had been cited in 17 different cases where students were being denied medical accommodations. Teachers who might have once ignored diabetic emergencies or asthma attacks now knew they'd face criminal prosecution. The database tracking dangerous educators had flagged over 400 problem teachers and prevented them from moving to new districts. Hundreds of schools had upgraded their emergency response systems and medical training programs. Most importantly, students had learned they didn't have to accept dangerous treatment from adults. They had rights, they had voices, and sometimes, when they used them, they could change the world. Today, I work as a pediatric emergency physician at a major children's hospital. My office walls are covered with thank you cards from families whose children I've helped during medical crises. But the one I treasure most is from Emma, sent when she graduated journalism school. "You taught me that ordinary people can become heroes just by refusing to let injustice stand," she wrote. "Thank you for showing me what courage looks like." Sometimes I still have dreams about that day in the chemistry lab, but they're not nightmares anymore. In the dreams, I'm back in that classroom, but this time I'm not alone. Emma is recording everything. Jake is ready to throw that granola bar harder. Mr. Rodriguez is there, prioritizing student safety over administrative convenience. And Mrs. Patterson is nowhere to be found. Because teachers like her don't get to hurt students anymore. Not on my watch. not in the world we've built from the ashes of my near-death experience. That's the moment I lost all respect for a teacher who valued her evaluation over my life. But it's also the moment I gained unshakable respect for everyone who chose to fight for what was right. And that fight continues every single day.